everyone, and welcome to episode 19. This is the first episode in our fourth series, where I'll be introducing you to the amazing and revolutionary field of evolution. In the first series, I introduced the basics of biology and the major groups of biomolecules. In the second series, I took a step back and examined all its biochemistry at the level of the cell. In the third series, I took a step back once more by looking at genes and how they get expressed like instruments in a grand symphony, all working together to develop, grow, and sustain an individual organism. In this series, I'll be taking one more step back by looking at populations of individuals and how their genes are slowly changed through time by the processes of evolution. Following this trend, the next series will cover in detail the evolutionary history of all life on Earth. I'm really excited about this series, and I'm really excited about the next one too. Evolution is such a fascinating topic. I love learning about it and reading about new finds, like unearthed fossils or uncovered genetic secrets. I'm fascinated with the story of human evolution, particularly with how we developed such large brains in such a relatively short period of time. But that's a topic for another episode. Today I'm introducing evolution as a scientific theory. And make no mistake, the theory of evolution is rock solid. For those listening with a background in science, or currently being educated in the scientific fields, you're no doubt familiar with the concepts of hypothesis and theory. In a scientific context, a hypothesis is like an educated guess, based on your observations of some kind of phenomenon. A hypothesis is what you test with an experiment. Your experiment will either refute your hypothesis, or will offer data that, as far as you can tell with your instruments and tools, supports your hypothesis. As you test more and more hypotheses with various experiments, you begin accumulating data. You start noticing trends or patterns, you see what works and what doesn't, and you begin to get a better idea of the bigger picture. If experiments and discoveries continue to pile up and accumulate, eventually you'll get a really good idea of what's going on. When you have enough data from testing all your hypotheses, you can then make a theory. A scientific theory is an explanation for a given phenomenon, which takes all the data accumulated over years of research and incorporates it together into a coherent entity. Newton's calculations on falling and moving objects led to the theory of gravity. Conversations between Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann led to the cell theory. And the independent work of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace led to the theory of evolution by natural selection. Long before Darwin and Wallace were alive, people would look at the great diversity of life and wonder how it all came to be. The Greek philosopher Plato thought that every different species had a perfect essence that defined them. The rabbit essence defined each rabbit, the birch tree essence defines each birch tree, and so on. Plato believed that the essence of each species was unchanging and immortal, fixed into their particular type or kind. Aristotle ran with this typological thinking and expanded upon it, building the so-called Great Chain of Being, which ranks species according to their size and complexity. Inanimate matter like rocks and dirt and ocean water were at the very bottom, then the lower plants like simple ferns and shrubs, and then the higher plants like trees and flowers. And this was followed by invertebrates, and then egg-bearing vertebrates. Above these are the vertebrates who give birth to live young, and at the very top sits the human being. In the great chain of being, the human is the ultimate organism, the ideal, perfection. Everything below the human is lesser in quality, increasingly so as one descends the ladder into the ferns and the soil. Everything on the chain, including humans, is unchanging in its essence and in its form. Aristotle's idea, this so-called Great Chain of Being, was basically the default position for close to 2,000 years. But in the early 1800s, the French scientist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck came up with the first major reformation to this idea of the Great Chain of Being. Working from the chain as a basic premise, Lamarck argued that the essence of a species would change by gaining complexity and moving up the ladder, so to speak. Without a sophisticated knowledge of the technical details, Lamarck hypothesized that organisms evolve greater size and complexity through a process called inheritance of acquired characteristics. This basically argues that individuals respond to their environment in some way as to give them a certain characteristic, which is passed on to their offspring. A classic example that you'll find in textbooks and most educational videos is the giraffe. The Lamarckian view is that the giraffe must stretch its neck to reach its food, and this stretching literally elongates the neck. As a result, the long neck is passed on to the offspring as an acquired characteristic. Another example is that of a bodybuilder. According to Lamarck's hypothesis, the bodybuilder has acquired enormous muscle mass, and this size would then be passed on to his child as the child's default state of being. This might sound a little silly, because it is. Lamarck himself gave up on the hypothesis of inheritance of acquired characteristics, as Darwin and Wallace were formulating their own ideas on evolution by natural selection. Darwin and Wallace both argued that the great chain of being was flawed. Instead, Darwin argued for descent with modification, positing that species in the past are the literal ancestors of the species alive today, and the morphological differences between ancestor and descendant are due to the gradual changes that take place over immense periods of time. Coincidentally, the study of geology was also maturing around this same day and age, and the consensus in the field was that the Earth couldn't be 6,000 or 10,000 years old, not by a long shot. The geologists of the time reasoned that Earth had to be millions of years old, maybe more, in order for things like sedimentary rocks to form. The development of radiometric dating, which analyzes the ratio of isotopes in a rock to determine its age, allowed scientists to determine hard numbers with regards to the age of the Earth. As I'll discuss in greater detail in the next series, the Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago. Life appeared shortly after the crust cooled, some 3.6 billion years ago. It was over this 3.6 billion year-long period, from the genesis of the first cells to the very present day, that the processes of evolution sculpted various life forms into what we see today. So a lot of scientific fields were maturing in the 19th century. Geology became much more refined. Biology became much more refined with the theory of evolution, and even paleontology picked up speed as a formal discipline. People had been finding fossils for centuries, but the data wasn't really organized or compiled into any coherent field of study. This was until the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when a scientist named George Cuvier came in and published his work on comparative anatomy. As the early paleontologists dug into the Earth, they would find various fossilized remains. Putting the full skeletons back together would yield a creature with unmistakable similarities to modern life. It was quickly noticed that many fossils in a given region resembled the animals living there today. Darwin argued that this was evidence of the fossilized species being the ancestors of the currently living species. As time went on, more and more fossils were found, and our understanding of our evolutionary past became a little clearer, piece by piece. As one looked between various depths in the rock layers, it was noticed that similarly shaped fossils could be used to connect related species and explain the ancestry of, various groups of species. The fossils began to tell a story through their transitional features, through features that gradually changed over millions of years in response to some kind of evolutionary pressures. A famous example of this is the study of the limbs of the first fish species that gradually acclimated to dry land, 385 million years ago. A species of fish possessed fins protruding from lobes that came off their sides. These limbs were little more than fleshy stubs, just little stumps with a few simple bones that could articulate the fin. But these lobes could also be used like really primitive feet to push against the ground and flop in a particular direction. Over time, those fish with the best articulation were able to move the fastest, the most efficiently, and they got most of the available food. And so within 10 million years, the bones in the fish's lobes had split apart into smaller pieces, allowing it a greater degree of articulation. At this point, the fish species can't really even be called fish anymore, as they spend more time on the land than in the water. They're four-footed amphibious creatures, the first true tetrapods. Within another 10 million years, the small bones in the tetrapod foot had evolved to align and radiate outwards in the shape of primitive toes, no longer clumped together in a lobe or flipper shape. It only took another 3 million years for the tetrapod hand to evolve an obvious chirality, with longer fingers in the middle of the hand and shorter fingers on the edges. Not all the evidence for evolution comes from fossils. A great deal of data can be found in organisms alive today. One of the first things that evolution could explain were vestigial traits, or traits that are kept in the organism but serve no function. These vestigial traits are proof of evolution because they demonstrate that species can change through time. What was once a trait heavily used by an ancestor species is now little more than a peripheral growth or unused feature in the modern species. The human being has several vestigial features that served a purpose in our ancestors, but is reduced or non-functional in our bodies today. For example, when we're cold, we get goosebumps, which causes our hair to get raised up, makes those little bumps and the hair follicle stands up. In monkeys and other creatures with thick coats of hair, this would help them stay warm. A layer of warm air is created between the skin and the raised hair, and this helps insulate the monkey and keep it warm. Humans don't have a thick enough mat of hair for the goosebumps to really do anything. We haven't yet lost the ability to get goosebumps, and so for now it remains a vestigial feature. Humans also have a literal tailbone, called a coccyx, which sits at the very end of your spine, on the back of your pelvis. In our primate ancestors, and our currently living monkey cousins, the tail is a prehensile appendage that helps them swing from tree branch to tree branch. When the first great apes split off from the main primate populations, they lost their tails. And that's why all the species in the great ape family, like the orangutans and the gorillas and the chimpanzees, none of them have tails. And humans are a great ape as well, and we don't have tails. The coccyx is all that remains of our ancestor's tail, and it's little more than a humble protrusion of bone, like 2 or 3 centimeters long. What's really fascinating, though, is that during our gestation period, when the human embryo is developing in the womb, the embryo possesses a tail for about 4 weeks. This tail is built and then broken down as part of a series of highly conserved and coordinated gene expressions that ultimately create a healthy baby. Vestigial organs exist in many other species, like eyes or eye sockets in blind cave-dwelling fish, or finger bones in the flippers of whales, or pelvis bones in the lower abdomens of snakes, or the wings of all flightless birds. All of these things are vestigial organs that exist and serve no function in the species alive today. By the time Darwin's theory of evolution had spread around the world, it was obvious that the initial idea of species being this unchanging thing was false. Species could be shown to change over time, connecting living species with their extinct ancestors to form evolutionary lineages. Not only do species change through time, argued Darwin, but species can also change through space, through geography. This disproved our idea of the great chain of being, namely that every species was created and exists independently of all other species. You see, as a population of individuals migrates across a landscape, they separate themselves from other populations in their species just by sheer distance. If this distance is great enough, or the barriers between the populations become insurmountable, like a mountain or a great river is in the way, they won't interbreed. And if they don't interbreed for long enough periods of time, that is, if the two populations are isolated from one another for long enough, they'll begin to diverge into separate species. The most famous example of this is taken straight from Darwin's observations on his world-renowned HMS Beagle voyages. Darwin cataloged a huge number of species from the islands, most famously the mockingbirds and the finches. He noticed that these finches were all very similar, but they had specific differences depending on the island that they lived on. Darwin reasoned that at one point in the past, a single ancestor species had migrated out from the continental mainland out to the Galapagos Islands. The ancestor species either settled all the islands in a similar time period, or settled the islands one by one, but the net result, as Darwin saw it, was the same. They showed descent with modification as each population of finches changed to fit into the environment of its home island. For example, islands with thicker, heavier seeds had birds with larger, more powerful beaks, as these were ideal for breaking open these heavy seeds and eating the nutritious flesh inside. Birds with smaller beaks would be at a disadvantage on such an island, as they would be outcompeted for food and they'd eventually starve to death. On islands with small seeds, or seeds that required fine manipulation to acquire, the finches developed longer, thinner beaks. These were strong enough to eat the seeds, but not so large as to hinder the manipulation and acquisition of the seeds. Subsequent genetic study of the finches' genomes in the Galapagos have validated Darwin's claims. The Galapagos finches did come from a single ancestor species, who came to the islands all at once. They spread out, and then slowly evolved to better fit into each specific island environment. This similarity in traits between related species is called a homology. A homologous trait is a trait shared between two species that they both got from their common ancestor. Homologies can exist on the genetic level, they can exist during development, or they can be part of the animal's matured physiology. A genetic homologue is like a gene in a common ancestor that gets passed down to all of its descendants, and coding for a protein that serves the same general function. A developmental homologue is something that exists in an embryo during development. I already mentioned how human embryos grow a tail for a few weeks during gestation. This is a developmental homologue to the tails developed in other species, which generally share the same conserved set of genes. For example, human, cat, and fish embryos all produce tails and gill pouches. In humans, both the tail and gill pouches dissolve during development. In cats, the gill pouches dissolve, but the tail remains, and grows into a larger structure that eventually becomes the cat's fully formed, fuzzy tail. In fish, the tail structure is reshaped, and the gill pouches develop into functional gills. This suggests that most organisms contain the genes for gills and tails, as well as other genes involved in the initial development of the organism. Because these genes are so fundamental to the healthy growth of the embryo, the genes are tightly conserved through time. Any mutations to the genes are almost always going to be deleterious, as they'll interfere with the carefully balanced chemical orchestra that is embryonic development. This takes me to structural homologies, which are fundamental similarities in body design between species. My textbook has a quote from Darwin on this that's absolutely perfect. On structural homologies, Darwin says, "What could be more curious than that the hand of a man, formed for grasping, that of a mole for digging, the leg of the horse, the paddle of the porpoise, the wing of the bat, that all should be constructed on the same pattern, and should include the same bones, and the same relative positions?" Indeed, if you were to look at all of these animals, you would see that they all have 4 limbs, all with the same general bone structure. The major differences are really in the size and orientation of the bones, but their fundamental structure and shape in the limb is the exact same. The turtle, the human, the horse, and the bird all have a single humerus in the upper arm, a radius and an ulna in the forearm, a clump of carpal bones in the wrist, a set of metacarpals, and 2 sets of phalanges. This speaks volumes about the fundamental interrelatedness of all life. Try to see how all 3 types of homologies can interact with one another. Genetic homologies get expressed and manifested into the developmental homologies of the embryo, which in turn develops into the structural homologies of the mature, independent organism. Let me briefly recap what I've covered so far. The fossil record showed that species can change through time, and that living species are connected through a lineage to extinct species. The Galapagos finches showed one way that species can change through time and space, again demonstrating a lineage by descent with modification. The relatedness of species across evolutionary time has created similarities, or homologies, between species that exist on a genetic, embryonic, and morphological level. All of this data validates the theory of evolution. But what really seals the deal and makes the theory of evolution absolutely watertight is the massive amount of internal consistency. Across all of biology, even across multiple disciplines like paleontology, geology, and chemistry, the data all coalesces beautifully in support of the theory of evolution. My textbook gives an awesome example for the explanatory and predictive power of this kind of internal consistency, with the example using the evolution of whales and dolphins. So paleontologists identified a group of organisms by their fossils, specifically by a unique set of ear bones that belongs only to this group, which is called the cetaceans, and this includes modern-day whales and dolphins. Of all the cetacean fossils, some have long, fish-like skeletons suited for an aquatic environment, while others have more compact bodies with larger limbs meant for walking on dry land. All the cetaceans can be relatively dated by lining them up according to the age of sedimentary rock their fossils were found in. When you line them up in this way, from oldest to youngest, a distinct trend becomes obvious. Radioactive dating provides absolute ages to the fossils that corresponds to the relative ages between the fossils and the sediment. Geneticists created phylogenies of whales and dolphins and their nearest living relatives, finding the shallow water-dwelling hippopotamus to be the most closely related to them. Furthermore, many species of whale have vestigial hip bones, and many dolphins express vestigial hind limb buds in the embryonic stage, which, in other animals, would develop into legs. So all of this data, from geology to paleontology to taxonomy to genetics, all provides an internally consistent dataset that strongly suggests whales and dolphins evolved from a land-dwelling ancestor over 50 million years. It's really important to understand that evolution is not proved or demonstrated with a single fact, with a single point of data. The reality of evolution was only made evident through an overwhelming preponderance of data, slowly accumulated over generations of study and experimentation. Darwin broke the theory of evolution down into 4 points. First, the individuals within a population have variation between their traits. This is to say that some individuals are faster, others are stronger, some have slightly darker fur, others have a less noticeable body odor, and so on and so forth. Secondly, these variations in the traits are heritable. This is to say that tall parents will generally have tall offspring. Plants with broad leaves will generally have offspring with broad leaves. Third, Darwin reasoned that more individuals are born than can survive. More individuals are born than the environment can possibly hope to supply. This in turn creates scarcity and competition. The individuals within a population compete for food and other resources, and as a result, some win and some lose. Some organisms get to eat and reproduce, and others die before they get the chance. Fourth, this winning and losing, this difference in reproductive success, is based on the variation in traits seen between individuals. As some individuals are faster than others, they may be better able to evade predators. As a result, they're more likely to survive and reproduce. The subsequent generations of individuals will have a higher proportion of genes for high speed, as those individuals who were too slow to outrun the predator were most likely killed before they could reproduce. This process is called natural selection, which I'll briefly cover now, but I'll talk about in much greater detail in the next episode. The phrase natural selection is quite literal. The environment, or nature, selects who lives and who dies. This isn't to say that nature deliberately chooses individuals. Instead, natural selection is a passive process. Nature simply provides the stimulus, whether it be a geographic obstacle, an environmental pressure, or a predatory threat. If the individual organism cannot escape these problems, it'll die. If it can survive these problems and go on to reproduce, it's said to have been selected. The outside environment isn't the only thing that can create problems for an organism. If an individual can't compete with other individuals in its population, it'll die out. The finch whose beak is too small and weak to open the thick seeds will starve to death, while nature selects the finch with a thick, powerful beak. The mouse whose coat of fur is a dull white, he'll stand out in the grassy field, and he'll be quickly seen and killed by a predator, while nature selects the mouse with a dark coat for his ability to hide. The monkey with poor depth perception failed to grasp onto his branch and fell to his death, while nature selects the monkey with good depth perception to live on and breed. In this way, the dangers and threats posed by nature acts like a great filter or a great selection process for choosing which individuals will survive to reproduce. Of those that do survive to reproduce, they pass on their genes, their alleles, down to the next generation. Evolution is really the study of allele frequencies in a population, as this shows you if a trait is becoming more or less common in response to some kind of evolutionary pressure. To put all of this very simply, Darwin's theory of evolution basically posited that heritable variation leads to differences in reproductive success. The more fit you are, the higher your fitness, the more likely you are to survive and reproduce, and thus pass on your alleles to the future generations. So what does it mean to say that an organism is fit, or that it has a high fitness? This doesn't necessarily mean the organism is literally physically fit, with a lot of lean muscle mass and a low body fat percentage. No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. Fitness in a biological, evolutionary context means the capacity of an individual to survive the rigors of nature in their habitat and reproduce. An organism that has a high fitness in one environment may have a low fitness in a different environment. For example, elephants have a decent fitness for the African plains, but they would have a poor fitness for the Alaskan mountains. The fitness of a particular species can change as it migrates from biome to biome. This was the case about 3 million years ago, when the Panama Canal emerged and connected North and South America. Species that had been endemic to North or South America crossed the land bridge and entered the other continent. The opposite continents had much different habitats and environments that the species were used to. So many of these species that radiated outwards from North America into South America or vice versa, a lot of them died because they just couldn't adapt. Rodents, however, rodents in particular, were very good at adapting, and a lot of rodents that came from South America up north in North America actually thrived and did really well, and some of these include the armadillo and the capybara. But back to fitness. Fitness also differs among individuals within a population. Those who are better adapted are generally more fit and able to have more offspring than those who are less adapted. Okay, so now what is an adaptation? An adaptation is a heritable trait that increases the fitness of the individual, and it allows them to successfully produce more offspring than those individuals without the adaptation, or with a weaker version of the adaptation. Let me clarify the difference between an adaptation and Lamarckian evolution. Lamarck argued for acquired characteristics. That is, that environmental pressures induce qualities onto individual organisms, which are then passed on. This isn't how it works, because natural processes can't induce deliberate, beneficial mutations like that. Instead, natural selection works like a filter. The weak are culled, unable or unlikely to reproduce given their low fitness. Those with high fitness do reproduce, and their alleles go on to the next generation. Over time, alleles associated with high fitness exist in a higher proportion in the population, while alleles associated with lower fitness tend to die out and exist at smaller and smaller proportions in the population. An adaptation is a gradual development over many generations, where the least fit individuals and their alleles are bumped out of the gene pool, leaving only those alleles most suited to the given habitat. This should also differentiate adaptation from acclimatization. When you move to live somewhere much hotter or colder than where you came from, you might find yourself uncomfortable in the new weather. Over time, you'll get more and more used to it until it seems normal. You've been acclimatized to the weather in the new area. This has nothing to do with evolution, as the process of acclimatization doesn't alter your DNA. It doesn't change your alleles, or the heritability of those alleles. Only mutations can change alleles, and only through natural selection in long periods of time can those few beneficial mutations be preserved and eventually spread throughout an entire population. It's important to understand that mutations do not occur in a Lamarckian fashion. They do not occur in response to a particular stimulus. They're not deliberate, and they can't be planned for. Mutations are one of those things that just happens, and you can't really know when or exactly where until it's happened and affects a gene. In the vast majority of cases, the mutation impairs some protein or some regulatory sequence, and the organism suffers developmental or biochemical abnormalities. Sometimes the mutation doesn't affect the individual's fitness at all, but most of the time the mutation is deleterious, lowering the individual's fitness to the point of non-viability. In very rare cases, mutations can offer some kind of advantage, like a slightly more effective version of an original protein, or a more efficient chemical pathway. These beneficial mutations offer a bonus to the individual's fitness, making them more likely to survive and reproduce. As a result, their alleles are more likely to be passed on to the next generation. This repeats generation after generation, with the less fit dying off and the most fit surviving and reproducing, until the allele with the beneficial mutation is spread to a large portion of the population. In this way, evolution is not a deliberate goal-seeking process. Evolution simply takes what works and runs with it. It's the biological equivalent of throwing everything you have against the wall to see what sticks and going with that. Perhaps as a final death blow to the great chain of being, evolution shows that organisms do not belong in any kind of hierarchy based on complexity or perceived superiority. Evolution can make complex traits simple, and simple traits complex. It all depends on the species in question, the evolutionary pressures acting on them, and the base alleles, biomolecules, and morphology available to work with. Alright, that was a huge amount of information, and I feel like I really barely got started. But I guess that's alright, because there's another 5 episodes in this miniseries where I can explore this stuff in greater detail. I hope you learned something cool about evolution, and I hope this episode got you interested enough to maybe do a little research on your own. There are literally thousands of awesome examples of evolution in action that you can read about. Or you can tune into the next episode, where I'll be discussing the mechanisms of natural selection in greater detail. as well as numerous examples of how natural selection has affected species on our planet. If that sounds cool or something you might be interested in listening to, be sure to check it out. I appreciate the support from all you guys, and I want to thank you for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.